Developing nations say it's time to pay. It's all about the cost of inevitable climate change at this year's COP27. With developing countries suffering the brunt of the damage, we'll debate who should take responsibility and whether we're too late to avoid the worst. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is COP27. Well, the climate affects everything, from politics to economics. It determines how we build our houses and what we choose to feed our families. And nowhere have those choices become more difficult than in developing countries. A recent report commissioned by Egypt and the UK estimates developing nations will need $1 trillion every year by 2030 just to try to mitigate climate-related damage. Now, for COP's 27th year, leaders have flown to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, to discuss how to best adapt to our ever-warming world. UN experts have published a list of projects worth $120 billion that investors could support to help poorer countries cut emissions and adapt to global warming. It's an effort to address concerns that it's too risky to invest in emerging markets. And while the UN is trying to unite countries behind the cause, deteriorating relations between the US and China, the world's two largest economies, are a big concern for any progress at this year's meeting. And to that end, UN Chief Antonio Guterres issued a stark warning.
We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. Humanity has a choice: cooperate or perish. It is either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact.
From deadly heat waves to catastrophic floods, the impact of climate change has become increasingly apparent this year. So as 40,000 delegates gather in Egypt, the pressure is mounting to act now.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now or never. For us, there is indeed no planet B.
This year, the summit is taking place on African soil, where almost every corner of the continent has been affected by extreme weather in 2022. According to the African Development Bank, the continent is losing as much as 15% of its GDP growth to climate change. Currently, the Horn of Africa is experiencing its worst drought in more than 40 years, and the WFP says over 22 million people are at risk of starvation. And it's not just drought that the world is seeing. This summer, a third of Pakistan was underwater. Weeks of unusually heavy rains flooded the country, killing more than 1,700 people. The country is on a long road to recovery, but rebuilding comes with a hefty price tag. Pakistani officials estimate the cost of the damage to be about $40 billion. And it's not just developing countries affected. Europe saw the hottest summer on record this year. The high temperatures led to the worst drought Europe has seen since the Middle Ages. According to the World Health Organization, almost 15,000 people died from record heat this year alone. And if leaders can't find a solution to cut emissions, millions more across the globe will continue to suffer.
So while everyone agrees solutions are needed to address the crisis, not everyone supports COP27. While world leaders talk inside, protesters outside are calling them hypocrites.
There's no time anymore to keep coming to these COPs as an exercise where parties come in their private jets and are sponsored by Coca-Cola, etc., and we do a whole dance around an issue so critical and so urgent.
Adaptation financing and also climate finance for Africa, it's non-negotiable. We want world leaders to take this agenda very serious because our future as young people is at stake.
Like recently this year, back home from Nigeria, where I come from, the flood that happened as a result of climate change claimed a lot of lives. Can Adaptation Fund pay for that?
So considering that cynicism, can COP27 provide some real solutions to the ever-growing threats of climate change? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Brussels, Tim McPhie. He is the European Commission spokesperson for climate action and energy. Richard Munang joins us from Nairobi. He's a Deputy Regional Director of the United Nations Environment Programme Africa Office. And completing our panel is Kamya Choudhary. She's in London, and she's an India Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Thanks all so much for being with us. Okay, let's first, if we can, I want to look at the institution itself of COP summits. Kamya, have they produced enough real results and improvements to justify 27 years of gatherings?
Yeah, COP27, as we see it today, is a culmination of years of efforts, like you mentioned. And it's very much about all of us coming together, bringing various stakeholders, countries, activists, banks, and corporations, and to bring us together to build and strengthen a much needed consensus, in my opinion. The idea is to align our priorities that are inclusive of everyone's needs. So it's not just a bunch of countries in the global north telling others what to do. And the idea is to plan, prioritize, finance, and deliver.
Okay, then quickly tell us, what tangibly has been achieved via these 27 years? What's happened over the course of these years that actually wouldn't have happened, via the natural progression and improvement of technology?
So one thing to remember about COP as a platform is it's a multilateral coming together of countries, which means everyone's consensus is important. And I think that's important to remember in a world where we have G7s, G20s, and not every platform is as inclusive as this one. So everyone's vote counts, everyone's veto counts. And what that's meant is we've been able to decide what is threatening for us in our global trajectory, which temperature is unacceptable for us as a global society, and what we want done. And this means the discussion happens between various stakeholders. And one way that's been built into the system is having nationally determined contributions as part of the system. So their countries decide how much they can commit, what that exactly looks like. And these are regularly revised. So having regular COPs means we can regularly see and assess how we've done on those NDCs according to each country. So tracking progress is an important part of the COP platform. Okay. And the other thing it's allowed us to do is put together global finance. Because when we're talking about 1 trillion commitments in international investments to fight climate change, that means we need an organization where we can discuss how this $1 trillion is used, how it's implemented, delivered, and who it reaches, and how will that be accessed.
Okay. Tim, let me turn to you, because there are a lot of protesters out there that actually don't agree. They find this to be, the typical talk shop. It doesn't produce real results. And, there's also the irony of having a conference on curbing climate change while hundreds of people are flying in on private jets and other means of transport that contribute to some of the worst carbon emissions in the world. They're also, in this case, staying at massive hotels in the desert where water sources are horrifically scarce. Is that okay?
I think the point here is that you really need to get face-to-face as a global community to try and make progress. As Dr. Choudhary was saying, this is a multilateral system. It's really the only venue where the whole world comes together and you look each other in the eyes and you put pressure and you make each other accountable. And it's not often that you get these kind of forums and you have small, vulnerable countries talking to large, powerful, high-emitting countries or blocs, and that really helps in terms of raising political pressure. And I think that's really what we get out of the COPs. They are very complex processes. Going through the COP agendas and negotiations is something which, you need multiple degrees to understand how it all fits together. But the point is, it does work. It is global. We have over 190 parties signed up to the Paris Agreement, and this is how we get them to make progress. In terms of, where we hold these things and how people get there, we have a rotating system. Every part of the world gets its chance to hold the presidency, to set the agenda, to put on the agenda the topics which are most important to them. Of course, that does imply some costs, I think, for the traveling and the accommodation. But I think that is definitely outweighed by the fact that we all come together and make broader progress, and we take homework away with us to do after these summits as well.
So what do you say to the protesters who believe it's actually counterproductive, that, bilateral, trilateral meetings on a smaller scale could even be more productive and wouldn't cost the environment itself so much?
I think you need to to do both. I think there are many ways, many formats for these kind of discussions, and the European Union uses these COPs actually as a place to do bilateral deals. And our president of the European Commission, President von der Leyen, was there earlier this week. She signed a number of bilateral partnerships to promote renewable hydrogen, sustainable supply chains for critical raw materials, financing for forestry. So all of these things, when you have the world together, you can sign 5, 10 bilateral deals in one day, which otherwise you would have to make 10 trips to do. So, it's also an efficient use of time.
Okay. Richard, let me turn to you and let's look at the conference itself. We now have these demands for wealthy countries to step up to pay for the accumulative damage that their development has done to the climate that poorer countries are now paying the price for. Is it realistic to expect them to pay, and how exactly is it going to be decided and implemented as to who pays what?
Thanks very much for having me. I think the reality is that we, as the global community, the temperatures of the entire globe are 1.1 degrees today. And actually, we're seeing the catastrophic impact, drought and floods, events, hurricanes, cyclones, and these are causing damages. Human lives have been lost, and one life lost is far too many. And the reality is that most of the communities and countries that are suffering this have not contributed to the issue of the changing climate today. And so the best thing to do is to ensure that at least those losses and damages have to be compensated, as well as resilience of communities enhanced. And one of the best things that have happened with COP27 is that loss and damage is actually on the agenda. And what is going to happen is that the developed countries that have actually contributed much more to these emissions will have to put resources so that at least countries that are taking money out of education, out of health, to be able to address droughts or address floods will then have an opportunity to access this facility. And this conference provides that opportunity to work at the details. But we must appreciate progress because this is on the agenda for the first time. And negotiations are still ongoing. Then at the end of COP, we'll definitely know the way in which the financing of that facility will actually happen.
Let me ask you this, though, Richard. I mean, we talk about cutting carbon emissions to stop the warming of the planet, but we're already on track for 2 degrees, far beyond what the original goal was. And now we have the war in Ukraine, cutting gas supplies. So the consumption of other fossil fuels is now rising. Are we trying to, in essence, fix a problem that's kind of already too late to solve?
The reality is that 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Environment Programme did produce the report called the Emissions Gap Report, which showed that actually, with all the actions that the entire group have put together, we're going to reach 2.8 degrees. That then means that we need to reduce emissions by up to 45% between now and 2030. And as a result of that, where we are today, already at 1.1 degree, it means that we need to ratchet up ambition. Now, you've talked about the war in Ukraine. We're going to have challenges. COVID came, resources were injected to COVID. We have the war. There are going to be calamities, and we are going to have these stressors. And as a result of that, the changing climate is already showing that if we don't do something, this will only add and turbocharge what we're already seeing, floods, drought. So the world have to come together to be able to ensure that at least we move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Let's face it, the reality is that the place of fossil fuel is gradually diminishing. The assets will be stranded assets. The price of solar is reducing. And if you look at a policy dimension across the entire world, e-mobility, e-transport is actually taking central stage. And if you look at where the resources are going to be in terms of opportunities, they are going to be in clean energy solutions. And that means that if you want a sustainable planet and also sustainable opportunities in terms of jobs, clean energy solutions are going to outweigh the drive towards fossil fuels, which will have limitations very soon.
Okay. But Kamya, let me ask you this, going back to the biggest polluters really taking responsibility for the damage that's being done. I have to ask specifically about China. I mean, even though it is the world's first or second most powerful economy and one of the biggest polluters, they feel when it comes to responsibility for causing climate change, they should actually be exempt because they started decades later than their counterparts with industrialization. So how can you start really assessing responsibility when some countries will come forward with cases like that?
So yes, common but differentiated responsibilities is what you referred to. The idea that there is a historical set of countries that have accumulated emissions over time as they industrialized, and there are other countries that are now facing the repercussions who didn't have the same amount of time to develop. And who pays for climate action is an important question in that as well. And Chinese delegations and leaders have committed to not only pursue net zero, equivalent at the same levels of other OECD and mid-century goals. They are very competitive. They're investing heavily in renewable energy, much like India as well. And the idea is that climate justice needs to be the basic principle of everything we pursue moving forward. That means commitments made, like the $100 billion per year for vulnerable nations, must not only be delivered, but scaled up as well. And the idea is to provide financial support that actually is delivered to the global south and reaches the particularly vulnerable and low-income countries like small island nation states. And countries committing to this is really, really essential. And this is why COP27, like was mentioned, is an important platform to hold them accountable, to follow through with the promises that have been made.
Okay, so Tim, I'll ask you, I mean, who ensures that? Who ensures that money funding climate change programs and protecting developing countries is actually used effectively? Because that in itself is a huge job. EU taxpayers are not going to be happy hearing any stories that their taxpayer dollars are being spent to ill ends and ineffective use.
Of course, and that's a collective responsibility that we have as donors and also as project implementers, not just the European Union, but all parties that are taking part around the world. And I think the European Union is doing its fair share. We are towards that 100 billion target, which was mentioned. We are by far the largest contributor. We've contributed again in 2021 over 23 billion euros in climate finance. And of course, we have a number of other financial vehicles, partnerships that we're putting in place. So I think, as you say, I mean, we need a broader conversation as well about who should be paying, who should be contributing to climate finance. The target that it's currently in place, the 100 billion, has a fairly narrow donor pool. And the European Union also wants to be having a broader conversation about other countries, other parties that would be paying into that, and also how you really align all financial flows, including from the private sector, with the climate goals that we have. And that's something which we wanted to discuss on the agenda this year, which unfortunately wasn't able to get on the formal agenda. We hope that it will, of course, feature as part of the conversations we're having. And then on loss and damage, the European Union was very happy and worked very constructively to get this topic on the formal agenda. It's something which we feel as well is very important, needs a very detailed conversation to assess, what are the diverse needs out there. It's not as simple as putting together, I think, one fund and picking a number to put money into that fund. There are many ways of financing and averting loss and damage, and that's what we're looking to do, is find the right outcomes.
Richard, as for solutions and who can do what, you've actually been focusing interestingly on Africa and where you see real potential for impact. And I know you've looked and done a lot of research into youth and the informal sector. When you consider what proportion of the population that actually is, it seems fundamentally important that that is engaged. So tell us what is happening in that space.
Yes, thanks again. I mean, I think Kamya and team have put things in perspective. But when you look at the COP is happening in the African continent today, and it's actually called an implementation COP. But it's a continent where over 80% of the entire population lives in the informal sector. So the informality of Africa can never be ignored when it comes to climate change and climate change actions. And then it's a continent with the population, 60% of its population is youthful. And so if you're talking climate change action, climate change resilience, and to drive transformational climate action, you cannot ignore the 80% informal sector and the 60% that are youthful. And therefore, leveraging these constituencies, which I call them the biggest climate action constituencies, through the solution space, by inspiring them, by retooling their skills and giving them the tools so that at least they can be able not only to turn climate challenges into climate opportunity, but at the same time put money on their pockets and put on the table, can actually build resilience. Because let's face it, when you look across the entire world, one of the biggest challenges that Africa have got today, the biggest vulnerability of Africans is as a result of a low socioeconomic base. When there is a flood in Mozambique or a drought in the Horn of Africa where over 22 million people are already affected today, they do not have alternatives. But if they could be able to be socioeconomically empowered by putting food on the table and money in the pocket, they can be able to move elsewhere and still be able to survive. So the biggest socioeconomic resilience, the biggest resilience socioeconomics. And just lastly, I think when you look at these discussions at the global level, the common but differentiated responsibility on who pays is important. But when it's dovetailed down to countries, leveraging on this informality and understanding that the way it works elsewhere might not be able to work the same way within the African context become quite very, very important. Therefore, talking climate finance within the context of this informality, within the context of the money going to retool youth skills, develop their capacity, ensure that at least accessible institutions can be leveraged for the informal sector becomes very, very important. That is why we're really focusing on these constituencies.
Okay, but Kamya, let me ask you this, and I hate to sound cynical, but is it realistic to talk about curbing climate change, to improve and save lives when we know that our growing population of consumers, which is what we are, that is us, is actually what's straining the planet most?
I think that's an important point to raise, because the idea is that countries that are high emitters potentially but have very low per capita emissions, like India, are putting forward something called the LIFE mission. The idea is to promote low consumer and citizen-centric behavioral changes. So using behavioral economics to nudge changes and shifts in attitudes and how we consume, how much we consume. So the conversations have already reached COP, thankfully, around scaling down what our consumption-based emissions would look like. And the fact that corporations and companies are involved in this conversation means that they recognize that their emissions are big contributions and that they must limit and scale those down. And the commitments that are made by countries like India and China, as you raised earlier, are extremely ambitious for this reason, because without them, there is no trajectory to global net zero possible if we leave them out of the conversation. And similarly, like Richard mentioned, having African voices and African nations center stage currently, as is possible with COP27, is key, because they're a set of countries that commit least to emissions in terms, they contribute least to emissions globally, unlike other countries. So it's really important that their voices make space in where we're discussing, and their priorities are key there. And the idea is to make sure that the plans that we put forward are not top down. So it's not one size fits all. It's the idea is to make sure that the finance and the solutions and technology transfers reach countries, and then how they use it and how they wish to access them is up to them.
Okay. I mean, Tim, let me ask you about, the EU context. Are consumers listening? Do consumers want to continue growing their populations, but are they willing to take on the major responsibility to cut the consumer's role in global warming?
I think so. I think if you look at Europe, this European Commission has been in office now for 3 years, and the very first thing that we proposed was the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal came out of the grassroots climate movement. It came out of a big political wave for green and environmental issues at the European elections in 2019. And it also came from the science, which is completely undeniable. And what we've always been very careful to do is to make sure that European citizens understand that the Green Deal is a climate policy, but it's also an opportunity for economic growth, for job creation, and for creating new opportunities for Europeans. And that's the way we've designed all of our policies in the last 3 years. We are making a strong push for sustainable transport, sustainable fashion. We are looking at the supply chains globally. and how we minimize our environmental footprint through everything that we buy and sell and trade.
Richard, we only have a minute left. Tell me if you're genuinely optimistic.
Absolutely. The reality is that if you asked the first question to Kamya before and to Tim on whether we've 27 years, we've made progress. COP15, the world was heading towards a 3 to 4.8 degrees. Today, the analysis from the emissions gap report of UNEP shows that we are heading towards 2.8. So there is progress, but it is moving very slow. So already we are seeing that loss and damage is on the agenda for the first time. That's progress. Already we are seeing that the price of solar, renewable energy is coming down because countries are putting the enabling policies in place and moving towards that. That's progress. Already we are seeing that each and every country across the world have an adaptation plan, have a climate change strategy. That's progress. But we now need to move into implementation because that is the most important. That's what makes the difference. Implementation becomes important because that's how lives can be saved. And that's how resilience of communities can be built.
And Richard, that will have to be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thanks to our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.